Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals exam series, and we're back with a part 2 in virtual networking services. And also back is Mr. Ronnie Wong. Hello, how's it going?
It is going well, Vaughn. Thank you for, again, joining me as we continue through our idea here, of course, of the Cloud Fundamentals series, and specifically on a part 2, of course, on our virtual networking services. This is really one of those topics where there's a lot of easy information that Cisco can just throw at you because there's a lot of topics that are actually involved in this little section for the idea of understanding the networking concepts and, of course, the different appliances that we're used to, but then moving into the cloud. So before we get started down that path of where we are, let's go ahead, and what I want to do is make sure that we pick up from what we were talking about before. So a little bit of a brief review, and then we'll talk about what we're moving into, because that's how I ended last time, okay? So in the previous episode, we really did spend a bit of time in the upper left-hand corner of my screen here just reviewing these concepts, right? So Vaughn and I talked about all these topics here, essentially the VLAN manipulation, policy-based routing, WCCP, reverse proxy. Talked about all three of those as being kind of ways that we manipulate or we steer the actual traffic, called traffic steering, okay? But we also even talked about the idea of firewalls as another way that we can use that too, okay? So the firewall appliance allows us to do that. We can combine that together with policy-based routing to help us to steer the traffic and make it go where we want to go. Now, even though those are the ways that we traditionally would do so in just a regular physical network, okay, once we move into that idea of the cloud services and everything becomes virtualized, well, all of those functions that we're talking about in terms of traffic steering, they really get kind of wrapped up together in what is today called VPath, which stands for the idea of the virtual services data path itself. Okay, VPath takes over VLAN manipulation, policy-based routing, WCC reverse proxy that we have the ability to be able to do as well. Okay, now VPath itself doesn't run just kind of out there. It tends to run on top of the virtualization platforms that we're most familiar with. So, for example, when we actually are running, let's say, the idea of VMware's vSphere, okay, the VPath actually stands for the Virtual Networking Services. They call it VPath Virtual Networking Services, and it can actually run there, and that's where it was really primarily designed to essentially give us all the services that we need to. Remember that Cisco worked very closely hand-in-hand with VMware to do this. And then over on the right-hand side, I also have where we can do VPath services as well in the virtual networking services in Microsoft Hyper-V. So those are the two primary hypervisor types of roles that we have, okay? Now, notice that over on the right-hand side, and I'm kind of specifically focusing in on this one, okay, is that with the Hyper-V itself, as of at least for this exam, so I'm not going any further than that, which is going to be, of course, the Windows Server 2016 at this point. For this exam, because that was the last time that the exam objectives were updated, they can change it anytime they want to, but let's stick with what the exam objectives tell us at this point, so we know that we'll at least get some of this right? So in Hyper-V, you can't do all the different things, okay? Notice in VMware, Vaughn, that I can create what we call a virtual security gateway. We'll talk about what that is in a moment. I can also, of course, go ahead and add in an ASA 1000V, which is a virtualized firewall. I can also do a virtualized, I can't remember the acronym here, which is the Cisco Wide Area Appliance, Wide Area Application Service. There's actually a virtualized device for that. Also, Citrix has their NetScaler 1000V. Notice you're actually seeing this pattern 1000V. So it actually did conglomerate a lot of different things that they work together with VMware. And then there's even the Web Application Firewall, the WAF that they have from Imperva. So if you're running vSphere, and in other words, you're doing the VMware product, okay? When you start to do something like that, you have access to all these services. If you choose to run Hyper-V, you don't have access to all these services, okay? So you just have access to maybe the VSG, okay, which is that virtual a security gateway is what you have access to be able to do. So, in other words, it doesn't seem to handle as much. Now, just when I say that, as of right now, right? For us, Vaughn, we're actually in March of this year, right? So, as of this recording, okay, there may have been an update to Hyper-V and, of course, to the way that the vPath services work. But remember, it was originally what? A VMware or a VMware vSphere thing that allowed us to run all these things natively. So it might be now that they might have added in a few more, but as of at least when the exam objectives were actually written down, the VSG was the only one. So I emphasize that, Vaughn, once again for a specific issue. Okay, if you want to run any of the other things that we're talking about here, you've got to realize that you're probably going to end up choosing vSphere to be your hypervisor of choice to do what we need to. So the ESXi, and of course then running vSphere to make you to give you that option to do so. Okay, but just a very important thing for us to point out. If you go, hey, I don't have those options to be able to implement that, well, more than likely it's because you're on Microsoft's Hyper-V, is what you're actually seeing here. Okay, so that should give us a review, and now we're going to focus in and talk about, well, essentially these ideas of the virtual networking services and what they do for us and what we have to remember as we get started and getting prepared for the exam. Okay, so the way that ends up working out, Vaughn, is that if we take a look at something like this and this kind of very simple networking diagram in the cloud networking, okay, notice that over on the left-hand side, I can actually have a VM host. Now, I didn't actually draw the box around it like I normally do, but notice I have VM 10 and VM 11 over on the left-hand side, and they are connected to the VEM, which we did talk about in a previous episode, which, of course, is our virtual Ethernet module, and this is VEM 1. And then over on the right-hand side, I have VM 20 and VM 21, and that's also connected to VEM, or VM, how do you pronounce it, VEM 2 here, okay? Now, for those, we're going to connect those into our network. So they can use whatever protocol that they tend to use. It can either be a straight IP network. You can have these segmented into VLANs if you want to, or you can use VXLAN. If you're not familiar with VXLAN, we'll be doing that in a later episode where we'll cover that technology as well. But don't worry about that. Just talk about the idea of the connection. So Vaughn, if I want to send between VMware 10 and VM 10 and VM 20, okay? But let's say that what I want to do was actually to use, well, one of these networking services. Well, Vaughn, they're not directly connected to VEM1 or VEM2. In this cloud environment, they're actually shared services, and let's say up here somewhere. Okay? I'm just trying to make that they're not exactly in line, right? So if we had that connection between VMware 10 and VM10 and VM20, well, how do I get it, Vaughn, to go and use these services up here? So we know that from before, in the previous episode, we talked about the technologies, right? VLAN manipulation, okay? We talked about the policy-based routing. We talked about using, of course, that WCCP, okay? We talked about all that in conjunction also with firewalls that we can actually manipulate or not manipulate, steer the traffic. But Vaughn, now that I'm up here, I don't see the ability or anything that gives me that ability to create VLANs at this point, Vaughn, okay? So I have that virtual Ethernet module, okay? But I don't have that to be able to do. Now, the reason why is like, in theory, Vaughn, I could. But Vaughn, let's say that for us to be able to connect these two networks together, okay? Or the hosts together, or the VM host or whatever, so they're two separate servers running these VMs. But Vaughn, let's say that they're actually on separate ends of a single data center. So there's at least VMware 2 all the way through 19. So let's say that there's 19 other servers, or 9 other servers, right? 10 all the way through 20. So there's 9 other servers in between. Well, Vaughn, if I want to do that and configure them on the same VLAN, what would have to happen is that every single switch in between that would also have to be configured with every VLAN that's going to go across those switches too. So it begins to be a little bit more problematic in terms of how that works. So instead, when you actually use any of those things that we talked about before, it requires a little bit of knowledge and requires a lot of configuration to work. But with using something like vPath, it doesn't require that. What vPath does for us is it says, let's do this instead. Vaughn, you and I will actually create what we call a vPath port profile. Okay. A port profile, and there was no easy way for me to represent this, but it is what we call an interface configuration. So that's why I have it connected to this interface here. And I also have it connected to this interface as well. Okay. It actually allows me to create a template that can be applied and then distributed across the switches that I want them to be distributed across and on the interfaces that I want them to be distributed across as well. So Vaughn, that means instead of having to reconfigure everything along the path, I simply am able to actually create the vPath port profile that includes that ability to do some of that traffic, or not, traffic steering. I was about to say traffic manipulation, kind of the same things here. But that idea of actually being able to do the traffic steering that I need to make sure that when it gets sent out, it tags that traffic like what we talked about in the policy-based routing. It runs it through some type of, again, just analogous to the idea of policy-based routing. Send it out across network, and any of those machines that are tagged with that vPath profile, it knows exactly how to get all the way over here to VM20. Okay, so that means we don't have to manipulate everything along the way. We change it once, we apply it to where we want it to apply to, and now it has that ability to do so. Okay, so without ever knowing the infrastructure of the entire cloud, Vaughn, I'm still able to do traffic steering. Okay, now that might, hopefully it sounds impressive, but whether or not it actually really sounds impressive or not, it really is. Because Vaughn, in terms of a data center like AWS or even Microsoft Azure, we're not talking about 10 or 20 switches here. Okay, Vaughn, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of actual switches in which this stuff has to go across.
This is just being more efficient,
Right.
Because instead of going up and around, just like we were talking about with the VNICs, right? Where if you had to, and it would just hop across a little secret tunnel.
Yeah.
Just a lot easier.
Distributed virtual switch. Yep.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot easier to talk that way than having to go up and around and back through. We can talk to each other that way.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens here too. So the vPath port profile would actually tell these guys that, look, instead of connecting across the entire network, if there is that distributed virtual switch in the middle, use that path instead. Okay, and go ahead and take advantage of that. So we can actually have it do stuff like that. That's actually really neat. Now, I'm actually going to say, let's go ahead and we'll take the example of the VSG, which is the Virtual Security Gateway, and we'll run with that example for kind of the rest of this show as an example of how this stuff works. The reason why is because it's the primary one that was native to, well, the VMware itself, which is the one that we want to talk about, okay? So ASAV is Cisco's firewall that they've actually virtualized as an appliance as well, and also the WVAS, which is the Cisco Wide Area Application Service. I'll never remember that acronym no matter what. And then it's all combined together with a load balancer like the Citrix NetScaler. All that stuff, Vaughn, can be implemented in the same way. So it doesn't matter what this device is up here, and that's why I just simply drew an arrow. It can be any of these. I can use that vPath profile to say, take advantage of all this stuff if I need to, make sure it actually applies and does what needs to happen, okay, to be able to do so. All right, now, the other thing that can also happen is what we call vPath service chaining, okay? Now, on vPath service chaining, let's take for an example this. Vaughn, instead of just using one, like the VSG that we talked about, right? So I said I was just going to use the VSG as an example. What if you said, well, I don't just need the VSG. I need to make sure it runs through a firewall. I need to make sure it goes across a load balancer, and I need to also use this VSG as well, okay? So Vaughn, up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have an example of just a regular, let's say, VM, okay, that a desktop user might be running, but let's just do that, okay? I also have the CSR 1000 that allows me to connect across the network. But let's say that the target machine is VM11 over here on the right-hand side. But I need it to make sure that it goes across these three virtual devices before it gets to VM11, okay? So I need to hit the ASA 1000. I need to hit the actual NS 1000 for the Nexus. I should have said NX, and I don't know why. I can't type the letter X and say the letter S at the same time. Okay, NX 1000 for the Nexus 1000V if we wanted to. And then, of course, even the idea here of the VSG, the Virtual Security Gateway. Okay. So Vaughn, the way that this works is that we can actually do the VM service path chain, which I apparently can't say, and instead tell them exactly that. As data comes in through the service router, it can hit the ASAV that brings us into the network. The virtual Ethernet switch, instead of sending it directly to VM11, it says, oh, you've got to actually go to this device here, okay? So you got to go to the Nexus 1000V and get whatever actually is there too. And then it comes back to that virtual Ethernet module again. And instead of sending it directly into VM11, it chains it and it sends it over to the VSG gateway and then up to VM11 is what it does, okay? Now that VSG, that's the second time that I've used that without really explaining this, but this is called the Virtual Security Gateway. And this essentially is just a simple firewall between VLAN, or not between VLANs, between VMs that are within the same local area network, okay? So that's what this one is about. So if you actually want to understand that from a Windows perspective, this is the same as the Windows firewall, okay, is what it actually is. But it actually allows us to do this on that network, on that virtualized network scale. As long as they're actually in the same network, they can actually run essentially that host intrusion prevention system between each one of these, even though it's actually separated out this way too, okay? So that's that virtual security gateway. The idea, of course, of the Cisco ASA 1000V, this is a simple firewall that, I say a simple firewall, this is a fairly complex firewall that we can implement between the outside world and the inside world. So notice, Vaughn, that we just went over the idea of the VSG that allows me to essentially create a firewall between two VMs in the same exact network, okay? So that makes it a transparent firewall. It's not looking at IP addresses to make the separation. It says if you're in the same LAN, I want to establish a firewall between two VMs, I can do so. But what if I'm coming in from the outside like what this one is doing? I can do the same thing, okay? This one allows us to establish that idea of a firewall between internal and external networks as well, okay? So that is another possibility. Now, the other one that we may also talk about, and actually this was supposed to be NS, I told you the wrong thing here, okay? Let's say that that's supposed to be the NetScaler 1000V instead of the Nexus 1000V. I was trying to make sure I'm typing it right. So with the NetScaler 1000V, this one right here is for server load balancing. And this helps us to overcome the idea of bottlenecks that we can have when we have a single server that actually can be running. So what are some of the bottlenecking issues that we have to worry about? Performance is probably the biggest one. A single server can be jammed with so many different requests, which it actually can't answer anymore. So it either kind of freezes everything or it actually does, reboot if anything too, okay? It can even slow down performance instead. So instead, you can actually run that NS1000, which is for the NetScaler 1000V, and then you'll actually be able to deploy this idea of the software load balancer in between to make that end up working. Now, even though in the exam right now, at least what they reference on the exam objectives is the idea of that NetScaler 1000V, this has now been renamed and it has got expanded features. They now call it the NetScaler ADC, which stands for Application Delivery Controller. So a bunch of different things have happened over time, which you may end up seeing here. Let me see if I can change that a little bit here. I'll just expand that out just a little bit. And so this one is now called the NetScaler ADC, Application Delivery Controller. So that's a new name for that same device that we have that helps us, okay? It not only allows us to do the idea of load balancing between source and destination, which can happen, it can also, of course, do content switching for us if we need to. In other words, it can do selections based here on layers 5 through 7 on those services that are run. We can even talk about SSL acceleration if we need to, because it has built within it the idea of hardware-based encryption. TCP reuse allows multiplexing if we need to, compression, and web acceleration as well, okay? So all those are actually big possibilities that we can begin to see. All right, in the cloud, though, if you were to actually kind of implement something like this, let's take you through the idea of the path here of how this V path ends up working, okay? So the first thing that ends up happening is, so this is kind of a setup in what happens here. So here's the service, the networking service that we're talking about, the VSG. And when you create a policy, which is going to be over here on SC01, okay? This tends to run in Cisco LAN, something called the Prime Network Services Controller. you create the policy here. You, of course, can have the vSphere Management Center over here. And now you have as the virtual service manager, the Nexus 1000V, which we did review. That is what logically connects us to the network service. And those two are connecting us to the different ESXi hosts if you want to. Okay. So the administrator creates a security profile and they name it SC01. And when they do that, now they deploy it. And what they do is they push it out to the different devices. Okay. So what happens is, of course, well, it goes up to the VSG that gets the part of that policy. The Nexus 1000 receives it, and the vSphere also receives it as well. Okay. So when they apply it, it actually gets sent and actually applies to both the VSG and to the VSM, which is very important. And it's from here that the path profile now can go and say, hey, I need to include that policy in here. And you can create a port group in vSphere. Okay, a port group I'm trying to put it at the basic level so we're not having to try and explain every aspect of it, but it's similar to the idea of a VLAN, right? When you actually configure policy for VLAN, it actually only extends that VLAN. A port group says there's no real physical ports, so we'll just call it a port group instead. So you create that port group, and that now also includes that policy. So notice here where I actually put the administrator creates the port profile on the VSM, because that's where you create it, and then tells the VEM how to reach the VSG and how to put that particular policy into the port profile. So that's what happens as well. Then, of course, once they have that, they create the port profile in the VSM, and once they do so, it says tell the VEMs here how to reach that machine, the VSG, and how to actually put that port profile in its path. And now the vSphere is who deploys those particular profiles to what they need to, and that's what ends up happening. Okay, so now that's where VMware gets this down. Now, you don't have to worry about every single part of the path here, but understand that there's a lot more complexity behind it. So when we go into the cloud, it hides that complexity from us, but at the same time, for us to be able to actually know what happens and where it actually goes on, it's really between the Nexus 1000V at the virtual supervisor module, and of course the VEM, which is the virtual Ethernet module. That's where all the action really takes place. Until the port group says, all right, it's time to apply the policy to that particular interface, then we're off and going. So at the very beginning, it already has these on here, and it really is just making sure that everything is good in the way that we want. Okay, so that's a fairly complex idea, but just kind of understand that everything is based around this idea of that port profile. All right. With the ASA itself, remember the whole goal and purpose, and that's the key, right? It connects or allows us to securely connect to external networks not within the same network. And normally the actual networks provide us with a couple of different things that we want to. So here, Vaughn, I've kind of virtualized the services for us, and now you can see where they connect. So at this point, notice that the ASAV is connected to the ASAV is connected to the VEM and not necessarily to the actual supervisor module that we were talking about. Okay, so it's directly connected into each of the VEMs to help us to do this. We're normally running now physical hardware if we're doing this across Nexus 5000s, and notice that we actually have some more complexity that adds in once we start this. Okay, so if you're going to connect to an external network, all this stuff is hidden, but realize these are the components that are actually involved too. The other one is a piece of equipment that you should at least know the name of at this point, which is the Cisco CSR, which is Cloud Services Router 1000V. It essentially allows us to connect across the internet and across WAN services like what I'm showing you right here. Okay, so it gives us layer 3 features for each of the actual cloud tenants that we might have. Okay, so notice that on the MPLS network, even though they're actually within the cloud tenant, they might be to 2 different corporate LANs that they might be connecting to as well. The very fact is we establish an actual CSR on each one of those particular portions of that cloud, and that allows them to make the connections that they need to, okay, individually. So the idea that we see in terms of the topology, this is in case there's a failure. So this should say CSR2 at some point. Maybe. There we go. my inability to actually type correct diagrams. It's just the way it is, okay? So we can do this over a private, like an MPLS WAN, or we can do it across the internet. It just depends on what you want to do. This is another feature, and there's a lot more features to this CSR, but that's where it tends to fit into. So here, if you're using that, notice that you can create those tunnels. Even though there's actually just a single router, it will actually look like two separate connections over, which is perfectly fine. And the NetScaler will do the same thing. With the NetScaler, in terms of its workings, notice the cloud tenant here can have two different departments that it needs to. Once it comes in from the internet, it goes directly to the NetScaler, and then NetScaler divides out the load based on what those port profiles say. Okay, that's pretty much all it does. And here it's actually dividing it up between all four if the port profile is actually applied to it. And then, that's, again, based on that whole port profile. Now, here's that last one that we want to focus in on for the last few minutes, which, of course, is the Cisco Wide Area Acceleration Services instead. Notice the combination of different devices that we have here. Okay, we have the CSR router. We have WCP going on as well. And then we have the Wide Area Acceleration Services too. So when we have these connections established the way that we want to, app user 1 here says, hey, I need to connect out to wherever they want to connect out to. Well, instead, WCCP will send it to the router. The router will redirect it to the service, which is going to be right here, that application or Wide Area Acceleration Services instead. So it knows it needs to accelerate that type of network connection. So it's the WAS that connects out to the other side of where it needs to go. And from that point, once it gets over there, it now distributes that to where it needs to go as well. So it goes and connects to the VEM as well as to the endpoint device that it needs. And then from that point, you have the different services here, okay? So there's a bunch of different algorithms. I went ahead and just set this up exactly the way without trying to do a matching game here because I knew I'd be at the end of our time together. But these are the actual different ways that we can make this all work together, okay? Now, we're not going super deep into this at this point, but I want to make sure that I included the very fact that it's a lot more complicated than than just simply clicking here, here, and here. You do need to actually pay attention to some of this here. These particular algorithms are actually fairly important, so make sure you take a look at the idea of using TCP flow optimization. Standard-based compression scheme reduces the bandwidth in TCP flow. That's kind of a big one. Data redundancy elimination, so they don't have to send multiple data or multiple redundant packages, of course. The PLZ, the persistent limple ZIV, which says fools both sides of the connections, the thinking that they're actually on the same exact LAN. That's a pretty neat one. And then, of course, application optimization replaces the same data pattern that occurs per byte with an indexed 6-byte signature. What the heck is that about? Okay. Well, that actually says that for us here, and what it actually helps us do, if it thinks that there's going to be a possibility of something actually repeating, it can go ahead and sign everything that it comes in with a 6-byte signature here, and that way it indexes it based off of that to ensure for uniqueness that goes across. So there's a lot of information that we have that's right over there. Okay. All right. So Vaughn, that will actually give us kind of what we need as far as an overview goes when we start taking a look at some of the different networking services. Now, we're not completely done yet with everything that's right there, but we do still need to talk about the idea of VLANs and VXLANs and some of the other things. And we'll include in some of the other applications and services that we can actually take a look at in that next episode as well. Once we start talking about the idea of 3-tier applications and container templates and stuff. So there's a lot more for us to actually get through in terms of networking. So at least go back through and check out some of these different applications. You're not going to be quizzed on how to configure them, Vaughn, at this point, okay? But you do need to know that they exist, and at least the basics like what we showed you here. Understand the general logic behind it. Understand that the virtual networking services, it really depends on that vPath profile, a port profile that gets created and allows us to push out the policies that we actually need to, okay? So Vaughn, this is a great place for us to end this episode, but there is more to come, so we'll save that for another one.
All right. Well, that sounds like a plan. So we're just going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.